Hello again. I'm calling today's episode on a dark night in Georgia. And during this episode, I'm going to recount an experience that I had as an adolescent many, many years ago. Before I do that, however, I want to make a confession. Looking straight at you, I want to confess that for many years as a young person, I was a racist. And in a way, I couldn't help that, because I was born and raised in the old Jim Crow South. And in that Jim Crow South, everything was segregated, from our schools to our churches and our cemeteries and everything in between. And that segregation was based on law. Our state governments and our local governments had passed laws saying that white people were to live on one side of a color line and black people were to know their place and they were to live on the other side of that color line. And we believed all of this. We believed it fervently. As Governor George Wallace of Alabama said, we believed it's segregation yesterday, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And our belief in segregation and our acceptance that one race was inferior to another, of course, infected our daily speech. That awful N-word rolled from our lips every day, and we thought nothing about it. And it even infected our nursery rhymes. Children today can often be heard saying something like eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by his toe. But I assure you, that's not what we said when I was a boy. It was eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a, insert the N word by his toe. If he hollers, let him go, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. That's what we believed. We believed that segregation was the American way. We believed that segregation was God's way. God intended for the races to be separate. All of a sudden, however, during my adolescent years, out of the clear blue, so to speak, my segregated way of life was challenged for the first time, although frankly I was really too young and too immature to appreciate what was happening. And that's what I want to describe to you. But before I describe that incident, let me give you a little personal background information. When I was a boy of 12, my family moved from our home in Georgia down to the west coast of Florida, settling in St. Petersburg. We left my grandparents behind in Atlanta. And for several years thereafter, the great event of the summer for me was to board a bus in St. Petersburg, and I would ride all night on that bus to Atlanta and be met the following morning by my grandparents at the bus station in Atlanta. And for the next 2 or 3 weeks, I would be spoiled gloriously by them, and at the end of the visit, that travel pattern would be reversed. My grandparents would place me on an overnight bus in Atlanta, and I would travel all night back to my home and my parents in St. Petersburg, Florida. And it was during one of those trips from Georgia back to Florida that the incident occurred that I want to describe to you. My grandparents on that particular occasion had placed me on the bus. Atlanta was many, many miles behind us. Darkness had overtaken us, and we were out there in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of rural Georgia. And as our bus traveled down the road, there was some movement back there in what was called the colored section of the bus in that day and time. And somebody passed me moving up the aisle. And that somebody was not some angry young person, but a very old and frail black woman. And she tottered past me, moving from what we call the colored section of the bus up to the front. And she was talking to herself, but loud enough that we could hear what she was saying. And it's been so long ago that I cannot remember the exact words, but basically she was saying something to the effect that all of her life she had nursed and she had raised white babies. And she just wasn't going to take this anymore. She wasn't going to sit in the back of the bus. She was going to sit where she wanted to sit. And she sat down up there in the white section of the bus. Now, that was a violation of the segregation laws of the state of Georgia. Somebody quickly told the driver. The driver pulled over to the side of the road. He got up. He came back to where she was sitting. He told her to go to the back of the bus. She refused. She wouldn't do it. She wouldn't budge. And in disgust, he stomped back to his seat, put the bus back in gear, and we roared off down the highway and eventually came to some little Georgia town. The driver pulled into the bus station. He quickly disappeared. The rest of us just sat there waiting to see what was going to happen next. And what happened next was that a bulky deputy sheriff got on the bus. He came to where that lady was sitting. He told her to move to the back of the bus. She refused. And at that point, he placed her under arrest and took her off into the night. He placed her under arrest and took her off into the night simply because of where she was trying to sit on the bus. Now, I was an adolescent, and I really didn't appreciate what I had seen. To me, that was, at the time, just an example of some crazy old black lady doing something kind of stupid, and I shrugged it off. And I don't think I even mentioned it to my parents when I got home the next day. I never met that lady, of course. She just brushed by my side. I never knew her name. And I'm not entirely certain of when that incident occurred. But as I think back on my travels as a kid, I'm pretty certain that that incident that I have described took place either in the summer of 1953 or the summer of 1954, a long time ago. Now, as I said, obviously I had no way of knowing that lady's name. But there is another name that I'm familiar with, and those of you familiar with the civil rights movement will know the name as well, and that's Rosa Parks. Now, Rosa Parks was that quiet, unassuming lady who in December 1955 refused to vacate her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama city bus and move back to the colored section of the bus. And because she refused to move to the colored section, she was arrested, and her arrest touched off an uproar among the black residents of Montgomery, Alabama. This uproar led to a boycott of the city's bus system by black people in their effort to place economic pressure on the city government of Montgomery. Their lawyers fought out this situation in the courts, and eventually they won a tremendous legal victory in that the federal courts within a year or so declared the bus segregation laws of Alabama and the city of Montgomery to be unconstitutional. And because of the role that she played in the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks really remained for the rest of her life more or less the patron saint of the civil rights movement, and deservedly so. And another person who gained notoriety by her side, a person who worked very closely with her during that Montgomery bus boycott, was a young Baptist minister who only recently had moved himself to Montgomery, Alabama, and that, of course, was young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I don't mean to take anything at all away from Mrs. Parks, but what about the lady that I saw? Who was she? And why did she do what she did that night? What inside of her snapped and caused her to take that stand that particular night? And what about the other black people, and there must have been thousands and thousands of them, who in their way, at a time of their choosing, also took a stand and basically said, I'm not going to ride anymore in the back of the bus. I'm not going to take this. I want simple dignity. I want justice in my native land. Who were those people? Why did they do what they did, and whatever happened to them? Their stories we don't know, their names we will never know. As I've said, I was just a kid. I was just an adolescent that particular night. And honestly, I can't say that my views on matters of race were changed immediately. I can't say that. Like I said, I just shrugged it off. But obviously, I didn't forget it. And later, as a young adult, I saw and I experienced other things as the civil rights revolution in this country gained momentum. And for the first time in my life, I started to challenge. And then I began to reject the things that I had believed for so long about matters of race. And as my mind, as my heart, as my soul changed, my memory went back to that night in Georgia. And for the first time, I realized just how much courage it took for that old woman acting all by herself to stand up and basically say to the state of Georgia, I'm not going to take this any longer. And what she did certainly was not entirely in vain, because there was at least one person on that bus who saw what she did, one person whose views were eventually changed, at least in part because of what she did that particular night. That was a long time ago, a long, long time ago. And given the age of that woman, and she was an old woman at that time, I am sure she has long since passed from this earth. But even though I know that she has been gathered to her fathers for many, many years now, still there are certain things I hope for her. First of all, that was a very dangerous thing that she did that night. And I hope after her arrest, she made it safely through that dark Georgia night, and I hope eventually she was able to get back to her family. And I also hope that that lady lived long enough to see the dawn of a different day in Georgia. A day when, with dignity and with grace and without fear, she was able to ride in the front of that bus. I share this with you primarily for the benefit of those of you of a younger generation, to help you, I hope, to comprehend just how far we've come in the area of race during the past 50 or 60 years. Have we achieved perfection? Obviously, we have not. We're not where we ought to be. We're not where many of us want to be. But thank God we're not where we were back on that dark night in Georgia so many years ago. I hope there's something here for you to think about. I'll be back with you again soon. Take care.